Dust drifted across the yard. A knife had just left its sheath. The October sun fell on a trading post that didn't appear on any government map. The kind of placemen came to disappear from another one. Wooden fences. Men leaning against the rails, arms crossed, eyes empty, between two iron posts driven deep into the red earth, stood a full head taller than the crowd around her. Deerskin dress, turquoise beads at the collarbone, a heavy silver cuff on her wrist, on her left shoulder, a brand, still raw, still angry, who had marked her like cattle. The heavy man climbed onto an overturned crate. He raised his hand. The crowd went silent. The butcher stepped forward, wiping his hands on a stained leather apron. He drew his knife. He didn't open it. He just held it. Low laughter rolled through the yard like the first drops before a real storm. She did not lower her head. She was measuring the distance to the fence. At the back of the yard, a man without a gun slowly opened a canvas satchel. Wind pushed dust across the yard in slow, lazy sheets. It coated everything. The wagon wheels, the ward trough, the faces of the men leaning against the fence rails with their arms crossed and their eyes empty. Men who had nothing to do and nowhere to be, and had decided that watching something terrible happen was better than the silence of doing nothing at all. The trading post sat at the edge of a canyon shelf in New Mexico territory. October 1882. The kind of place that didn't appear on government maps unless someone needed it to disappear from one. Wagons stood in a crooked row near the eastern wall. Mule hulls stamped and tossed their heads. The boards of the stock pen were dark with old stain, not paint. The men at the rails knew what it was. They didn't think about it much. And in the center of that yard, between two iron posts driven deep into the red earth, she stood. Her name was Wire, and she was not what any of them expected. She was tall, a full head taller than most of the men watching her. Her shoulders were broad and squared, built from years of real work. Not delicate work, not careful work. The kind that leaves a body dense and certain of itself even when everything else has been stripped away. She wore a deerskin dress, brown as canyon earth, fitted close through the torso with fringe along the hem and both sides of the skirt. The fringe was cut fine. Long strips of soft leather that moved when she moved, even slightly, even just breathing. Along the neckline and down the front panel ran a row of turquoise beads, small ones. Sky blue and green blue and the deep ocean color that had no business existing in a desert, but did anyway. Each bead had been placed by someone who cared about placement. A wide silver cuff wrapped her left wrist. A layered necklace of hammered silver sat at her collarbone, the kind of piece that took a skilled hand and real silver and real time. Her hair was braided. Two long plaits falling over her shoulders, tied at the ends with thin strips of leather, dark as charcoal. Heavy enough that when she turned her head, which she did slowly and deliberately, they shifted with a weight that made you notice. The dress had been torn during transport. A long rip at the left shoulder seam. The deerskin gaped where it had been grabbed and pulled. Dust had settled into the exposed skin. The turquoised beads along the neckline were intact except for 3 that had been broken off. Little craters in the pattern where something had been on her left shoulder, visible through the top fabric, a brand, a red X. The skin around it was raised and shiny. Still healing, still angry, the kind of wound that would scar thick and permanent, and would never let the person wearing it forget the day it was made. Her wrists were shackled, iron cuffs connected by a short chain to the posts on either side of her. The metal had rubbed the skin raw at both wrist bones. She held her arms slightly forward to keep the chain from pulling tight. She was not looking at the crowd. She was looking at the fence, specifically, the gap between the 3rd and 4th post on the eastern side. She was measuring it, calculating. Her eyes moved the way a person's eyes move when they are not panicking but are instead doing quiet, precise mathematics about what happens next and what happens after that. She was not afraid, which was the thing none of them could quite process. Harlan Voss stood on an overturned crate near the center of the yard. He was 50 years old and built like a rain barrel. Thick through the middle, narrow at the shoulders, with a face that had learned to smile without meaning it, sometime around 1860, and had never unlearned the habit. He wore a brown vest over a white shirt that had been white once. A silver watch chain looped across his belly. He kept touching it. A nervous habit dressed up as confidence. Voss ran the Dustwell trading post, which meant Voss ran Dustwell, which meant in this particular corner of New Mexico territory. What Voss said carried the weight of law because there was no other law within a day's hard ride, and the men who made law were busy with other things, and nobody was writing letters on behalf of people like her. He raised his hands. The murmur in the yard went quiet. "Gentlemen," Voss said. His voice was practiced. "Smooth the way river stones are smooth. You'd never know they had edges unless you tried to pick one up wrong. What we have here is a situation requiring resolution." A few men shifted, too big to breed. He said it like he was reading from a ledger. A fact, a number. A notation in a column that didn't require feeling. No tribe claims her. No authority disputes the sale. She was brought in legal, documented, and stamped. He paused. And she's being sold as meat to recover losses. Silence, then laughter.
Low and scattered.
Like the first drops of something ugly before the real weather started. Over by the pen gate, a man named Decker wiped his hands on a stained leather apron. He was the butcher out of Colfax County. Here because someone had sent for him. Because someone had decided this was a practical matter, an economic one. He looked at wire the way he looked at everything he was about to cut. Measuring, calculating yield. He reached down and drew the long knife at his belt. He didn't open it. Not yet. He just held it. And Wire saw it. Her eyes moved from the fence gap to the knife and back to the fence gap. A small adjustment in the calculation. A new variable entered into the math. She set her heels deeper into the red dirt. She did not ask for help. She did not lower her head. She was already deciding which direction to run if she could break the left post. If the chain had any give. If her shoulder could take the impact of throwing her full weight against iron. She was deciding, not surrendering. Colt Yarrow stood at the back of the yard near the supply wagon he'd driven in at first light. 34 years old, former cavalry scout, former tracker, former man who carried a rifle like it was part of his body and used it without thinking too hard about what using it cost. Former now he drove freight, iron fittings, flour sacks, mail pouches, barrel hoops. The things that kept small settlements from falling apart at the seams. He'd delivered a load of nails and canvas to Dustwell at dawn, and had been waiting 3 hours for the store clerk to finish the inventory count so he could get his signature and leave. He wore a faded green shirt with the sleeves rolled, dark trousers tucked into scarred boots that had walked more miles than he could count and had the shape to prove it. A canvas satchel hung at his left hip. Inside it, a battered freight ledger, a folded invoice with small print. A brass seal the size of a silver dollar, stamped with an eagle and the initials of a Union logistics office that had been dissolved in 1878. He kept the seal because he'd found it in the bottom of a crate once and hadn't thrown it away. He wasn't sure why he'd kept it, until now. He stood with his arms crossed, his jaw still. He watched the yard the way he had learned to watch things that were about to go wrong. Quietly, completely. The way you watch a fire you're not sure is going to stay contained. He did not carry a gun anymore. He had stopped carrying one 3 years after the war because of who he became when he had one on his hip. The version of Colt Yarrow who wore a gun was fast, accurate, useful in specific terrible situations. Also someone he did not want to be in a room with. No gun, just the ledger, the invoice, the brass seal, and the particular stillness of a man doing math. He watched Wire. He read her breathing. Slow, controlled, not the shallow flutter of panic, the deep, deliberate draw of someone rationing air because they knew they might need everything they had very soon. He read the way she set her feet. Heels pressed in, weight low, ready to absorb impact or generate it. He read where her eyes went, the fence, the knife, the fence again. And he read something else, the beadwork on her dress, 3 beads missing from the neckline, the silver cuff still on her wrist, the braids still tied, still intact. These were things a person kept because they mattered. These were not things a person kept if they had given up. She had not given up, which meant someone could still make worse or better in the next 60 seconds. And the choice of which one belonged to whoever decided to move first. Colt thought about walking away. He was good at walking away from things that were not his problem. He had built that skill deliberately over years, after the war had demonstrated in graphic and irreversible terms what happened when a person inserted themselves into that were already burning. He had a schedule. The canyon road home was rough going. His mule had a left rear shoe that was starting to pull and needed a proper look before the next long stretch. There was coffee in a tin on the stove in his shack. There was a stack of split oak by the door, and a roof that kept most of the rain out. He pictured it. The stove, the coffee, the quiet. Then he pictured this yard tomorrow, the same men, the same story. The same casual, brutal laughter echoing off the same adobe walls. The thought sat in his chest like a coal. He had felt this exact weight before. Once in Missouri, 1869, a farmhouse on fire, 2 children in the upper window. A crowd of 15 men standing in the yard watching because the heat was too much and the risk was too high, and someone else would surely do something soon. He had been the someone. He had not liked the fire. He had not liked the scarring on his left forearm that still pulled tight in cold weather. He had liked even less the idea of standing in that yard and watching the window, so he uncrossed his arms. He opened the satchel. Voss was still talking, the way auctioneers do. Laying the ground so the ground feels inevitable, so that what happens next feels like it was always going to happen, like no one could have stopped it, like stopping it wouldn't even occur to a reasonable person. Colt stepped forward, not fast, not slow, the pace of a man with paperwork to attend to. He set the freight ledger on the top rail of the fence, flat, open. He reached into the satchel and produced the folded invoice, spread it next to the ledger. Then he placed the brass seal on the ledger page. The eagle caught the morning light, blinked like a real thing. He did not raise his voice, federal freight custody. Even, measured, the voice of a man reading a notice that had already been filed. This individual is logged under protective transport order, confiscated from irregular sale pending federal inspection. I'll sign her out and process the transfer. Silence, a different kind of silence than before. Voss's practiced smile slipped, didn't fall, just slipped. Like a man on ice who catches himself before he goes down but knows everyone saw it. He looked at Decker. Decker looked at the knife in his hand, then at the seal, then at the men at the fence rail, who had all found something extremely interesting to look at on the ground in front of their boots. Nobody wanted to be on a federal form, even a false one, especially a false one, because if it was false and they'd argued with it, then their names were already attached to whatever came next. Voss opened his mouth. Colt pressed the seal into the page. The sound it made was small. A soft thunk. The kind of sound a period makes at the end of a sentence that is not asking a question. Voss closed his mouth. Colt did not wait for agreement. He moved to the left post, lifted the chain from the hook where it had been looped, wrapped the slack around his own forearm so it wouldn't drag. He left a gap of 2 feet between himself and wire. He did not touch her skin. He did not push her. He did not position himself in front of her. He stood beside her. Walk, he said. Not an order, not a performance. The word he would use for a mule he respected, even, certain, with room in it for her to decide what to do with it. She moved, not because he told her to, because she had already decided this exit was better than the one she'd been calculating, and the math had just changed in her favor. They moved through the gate, the crowd parted. Not much, enough. Boots scuffed dirt, someone spat and missed, no one blocked the way. No one said anything with teeth in it. The chain clinked once against the fence post and went quiet. Wyer's breathing did not change. Colt's heart was doing something complicated in his chest. He felt it in his throat, in the tight space behind his ears. He kept his eyes forward and did not look back at Voss's crate. Outside the yard, the wind was cooler. A dog barked from behind the far shed. Colt's mule lifted its head from the trough and snorted. Colt stopped beside the wagon tongue. He turned to face her for the first time at close distance. She was taller than he'd calculated from across the yard. Standing this close, with no fence between them, he had to look up slightly to hold her gaze. Her eyes were dark, steady, deep as water with no bottom, and they were doing to him exactly what they'd been doing to the fence gap and the knife and the eastern gate. Reading him, he let her read. He checked the brand on her shoulder. The flesh was raised, blistered in places where the skin had split. The X was wide, deep, made by someone who wanted it to last and didn't care what it cost the person wearing it. He felt anger. He kept it entirely off his face. He nodded toward the barrel at the back of the wagon. "Water," he said. He pointed. He kept the movement slow and obvious, nothing sudden. She watched his hands, then his face. She looked for the thing that most men in this territory were looking for when they looked at her. She didn't find it, which confused her, which she did not let show. She stepped to the barrel. She drank in steady pulls, not fast, not desperate, the measured pace of someone who had learned never to show how much they needed anything. Her throat worked. The silver necklace shifted against her collarbone. She set the dipper down without a clatter. She did not thank him. She did not owe him that yet. He did not expect it. He opened the ledger. He wrote his name, the date, a line about protective custody. He pressed the seal in again. He left the book open on the wagon rail where anyone walking past could see it. He looked at her. "I drive out now," he said. 8 miles to a shack. A pause. "Better than here." He waited. She looked at the road, then at the porch where 2 of Voss's store clerks had come out to watch, then at the knife still on Decker's belt, visible through the gate. She looked back at Colt. She nodded. Once he untied the mule, checked the left rear shoe, decided it would hold for 8 miles if he kept the pace steady. He lifted the wagon tongue, set the pin, climbed to the seat. He kept the reins loose. He did not tell her to keep up. He knew her legs were long. As the wagon began to move, she fell into pace beside it. The fringe of her dress moved with her stride. The turquoise beads caught light in small flashes. Her braids shifted across her shoulders. She walked the way she stood, grounded, certain, like her feet knew exactly how much pressure the earth could take before it needed to be treated differently. He took inventory without thinking about it. 1 mule, 1 wagon, half a barrel of water, a sack of cornmeal, 2 blankets, a small jar of bare grease, a cold stove 8 miles east, and a person who had been sold as meat walking beside him in a dress worth more than anything in that stove-cold shack. He felt the weight of what he'd done settle across his shoulders, not regret. Regret would have been leaving her there. He knew that with the same certainty, he knew the left rear shoe was going to need proper attention before the end of the week. He looked at her as they cleared the last outbuilding of Dustwell. He made his voice plain. "My name is Colt," he said. "I haul freight. I fix things. I don't sell people." She turned her head slightly. Her eyes found his dark, level. Still reading, she said nothing, but her face told him what he needed to know. Fear held down with both hands by something stronger. Stress tucked into the set of her jaw. A readiness that had been there so long it had become posture, and underneath all of that, small, almost hidden, a question. What does this man want? He let the question sit. He would answer it with what he did next, not with talk. He had learned that much from the war, that some things cannot be said into existence. They can only be built, slowly, with consistent action, over enough time that the other person stops waiting for the floor to drop. He turned forward. The wagon wheels found the canyon road. The trading post fell behind them. The road was rough, red rock and loose shale, and the kind of dust that got into your mouth even when you kept it closed. Colt guided the mule around the worst of the ruts. The animal knew the trail and didn't need much direction, which left him free to pay attention to other things. He watched the ridgeline. No dust plume, no riders, no sound except the wind and the wheels and the occasional ring of iron shoe on stone. He watched her. She walked with her eyes forward and her chin level. The fringe at her hem moved. The silver at her collarbone caught and released light as the road curved. She didn't favor either foot. Whatever pain she was carrying from the shackle burns and the transport and everything before that, she carried it internally, completely. Without leaking, he thought about what it took to do that. He thought he probably didn't fully know. They didn't speak again before the first ridge, an hour of road. An hour of wind and wheel sound, and two people doing the work of staying upright and moving forward, which was sometimes the only honest thing a person could do. At the top of the rise, he stopped the wagon and turned. No rye dust. He exhaled once. Did not let his shoulders drop. Another hour, he said. He pointed ahead to where the canyon cut deepened into shadow. Then shelter, she looked at where he pointed, then back at him, and he saw it. Barely. The way her face changed at the edges when something registers but isn't ready to be believed yet. A small release at the corners of her mouth, at the outer edge of her eyes. Not relief. Not yet. A mark in her own internal ledger. He said shelter, and he knew where it was. She turned forward. They went on. The shack appeared at near full dark. One room. Plank walls gone grey from years of wind and sun. A stone chimney at the east end. A small lean-to attached to the south side that sagged at one corner, but hadn't come down yet. Colt had patched the roof the previous spring with canvas and pine tar, and it had held through one hailstorm, which he considered proof of something. He pulled the mule up beside the water trough, unhitched the traces, rubbed the animal down quick with a rag, and checked the left rear shoe in the last grey light, loose but not pulling. Another day, maybe two. He filled the dipper from the trough and held it toward Wire. She took it, drank. Her hand shook slightly when she handed it back. He noticed. He said nothing. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, struck a match inside. The flame lit the room in a small warm circle. Rough table. 2 chairs, iron stove in the corner with a cold belly. A bedroll on the floor near the south wall, a shelf holding 2 tin plates, a cup, a small crock of salt. No luxuries, nothing decorative. The home of a man who lived in a place rather than built one. He watched her eyes move through the room. She didn't look frightened. She looked systematic, the way you look at a map before you commit to a road. She stayed near the door until he crossed to the stove and began setting kindling under the grate. When the first fire caught, the room changed. The cold smell of old ash gave way to something living. Heat spread slowly from the iron. The shadows pulled back to the corners. He filled the pot, set it on the stove, reached for the bag of beans on the lower shelf. Sit, he said. Not a command, a word with space in it. She sat on the bench against the north wall, hands on her knees, still wearing everything. The silver cuff, the necklace, the braids, the torn dress over the wounds he hadn't been able to look at yet. He worked the stove without crowding her with his eyes. While the water hissed, he brought a tin basin and set it on the table. Filled it with water from the kettle, warm but not hot. Laid a folded cloth beside it. He nodded toward her shoulder. That burn needs cleaning. He stepped back. He kept the distance obvious. Do it yourself if you'd rather. He turned back to the stove. He heard the small sound of fabric moving, the quiet dip of cloth in water. Once he glanced sideways. She had pulled the torn shoulder of the dress down, exposing the brand. She pressed the wet cloth to it. Her breath hissed but once between her teeth. Just once. Then, steady, she worked the cloth carefully. She found the jar of bear grease he'd set near the salt and applied it with slow, deliberate fingers, working it into the angry skin without flinching at what she found there. He stirred the beans. He kept his attention on the pot. Some things a person needs to do for themselves. Some things a person needs to not be watched while they do. When the beans softened, he ladled them into a bowl and set it on the table. He stepped back. She looked at the bowl, then at him. She sat and ate, small, careful bites, not starved, not greedy. The pace of someone who had learned to respect food because there had been times when there wasn't enough of it. She ate half the bowl before he took his own serving. They ate in silence. The stove ticked as the iron expanded with heat. Outside, the wind found the gap under the door and came in cold along the floor. When she pushed the empty bowl toward him, he took it without comment. He pulled a grey wool blanket from the crate near the wall, shook it out, set it on the end of the bench. "Fire will hold the room warm," he said. "You can sleep by the stove." He pointed to the corner nearest the hearth. Clean boards. Out of the draft, then he spread his own bedroll near the door, boots beside it, satchel within reach. He lay down and looked at the ceiling boards. He thought about Voss, the men at the fence rail, and their empty eyes. How easy it would have been to stay at the back of that yard and watch and tell himself there was nothing to be done. He thought about whether Voss would send men after her. Probably. Loose men like Voss didn't like loose ends. Loose ends had names, could show up later with their own version of events and a description that matched someone specific. He would be ready if they came. He'd given up the rifle 3 years ago, but he remembered how to hold one. The muscle memory didn't leave. It sat in the hands like an old skill waiting to be needed again. Across the room, Waya lay near the stove, with the blanket pulled to her chin. Her eyes were open. She was watching him, not out of fear, out of calculation. The same deliberate measuring she'd been doing since the yard. She was reading his breathing, his position, the distance between his hands and the satchel, the gap between his body and the door. She was learning the room, she was learning him. She had expected pain tonight. Maybe worse than pain. Instead, there was heat from the stove and food in her stomach, and a man who had looked at the brand on her shoulder and set his jaw and said nothing except what she needed to hear. That unsettled her more than cruelty would have. She knew cruelty. She could read cruelty in the first 3 seconds of a room. This she did not know how to read, which meant she had to stay awake until she did. She thought about the fence gap. She'd had it measured, 3rd post and 4th, a body width gap if she angled right, if the chain gave even 6 inches of slack, if she could generate enough momentum from a standing start with both arms chained forward. She'd had it. And then the man with the ledger had stepped out of the crowd, and the math had changed, because the fence gap led to open desert with no water and a brand on her shoulder that every man between here and the territory line would recognize. The ledger and the seal, fake as they almost certainly were, led somewhere else entirely, somewhere she hadn't been able to see from inside the yard. She was seeing it now, 4 walls. A stove, beans, and a man sleeping near the door with his boots on and his hands open and empty on his chest. Open hands meant something. She watched them for a long time. The fire dropped low. The room settled into the quiet of a space shared by 2 people who were both pretending to sleep. Outside, a coyote called once from the far slope, long, rising at the end like a question. The answer didn't come. She kept watching the hands. Open, still. A foot from the satchel. He'd left the brass seal in the bag. He'd written his name in the ledger. She turned that over. A man who lies to save a stranger doesn't write his real name in a book he leaves open, unless the name is real, unless he is not afraid of it being seen. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it, added it to the calculation, closed her eyes, not to sleep, to think more clearly. And somewhere between the counting and the coyote and the slow pull of warmth from the iron stove, she slept. Not because she decided to trust him, because her body had made a different calculation than her mind. And for the first time in longer than she wanted to count, it had decided the room was safe enough for now. Just for now, the fire held, the wind worked the walls. And in the small shack on the canyon shelf, two strangers lay in the dark with the whole weight of the next day still ahead of them. Neither of them ready for it, both of them unable to afford anything else. The morning after the first night came in cold and grey, not storming, not dramatic, just that flat, colourless cold that settles into the canyon shelf before dawn and doesn't apologize for itself. Colt was awake before the light. He always was. 3 years of freight runs across canyon trails had reset whatever internal clock the war had broken, and now he woke at the same hour, every morning whether he wanted to or not. The hour before the sky decided what it was going to be. He lay still for a moment, listened. The stove had burned down to red coals under a skin of grey ash. The wind had dropped sometime in the night outside. The canyon was quiet in the way it got when the temperature fell fast, and everything alive decided to wait until the situation clarified before committing to movement. Inside, the sound of breathing that wasn't his. He turned his head. Wire was asleep, actually asleep. Not the tense, watchful half-rest he'd expected after seeing her eyes still open at midnight. Real sleep, deep and even and undefended in the way sleep only gets when the body has finally overruled the mind and said enough. We are done. We are stopping here. She lay on her side facing the stove, the grey blanket pulled to her chin, her braids loose against the floor planks, the leather ties still in place, but the plaits relaxed, the dark hair spreading slightly at the ends. The silver necklace had shifted sideways against her collarbone. The wide cuff on her wrist caught a thread of ember light from the stove grate and held it. Her face in sleep was different than her face awake. Not softer, exactly, not younger, just unguarded. The jaw that spent its waking hours set against the world had released. The slight furrow between her brows that came from constant calculation, gone. She looked like what she was, a person, tired. Finally, briefly, safe enough to stop, Colt sat up slow, kept the floorboards from speaking, fed the stove without striking a match, just opening the grate, and laying in fresh kindling over the coals until the fire found it, fiffled the kettle from the water barrel, set it on. He let her sleep another half hour. He used the time to check the mule in the pre-dawn dark, refill the trough from the barrel, and look at the left rear shoe in the grey beginning of morning light. Loose at the heel nail, would need attention today. When he came back inside, she was sitting up, blanket still around her shoulders, hair still loose at the ends of the braids, eyes doing that reading thing again, taking inventory of the room, the stove, the kettle, him, the door, the window, him again. In that order, he poured coffee into a tin cup, added a splash of cold water to bring it down from scalding. He held it out. She looked at it, then at him, then at it again. Which, fine, he understood that. He set the cup on the floor near her blanket and stepped back to the stove without comment. After a moment, she picked it up, curled both hands around the tin. The silver cuff caught the morning light coming through the window. She drank, and he watched the stiffness in her shoulders ease by a fraction. Just a fraction. But he was paying attention. He poured his own cup. They sat in the quiet of the stove and the kettle and the early light. And then Colt did the thing he had been not doing since the yard. He reached into the satchel. He took out the length of chain that had connected her shackles to the iron posts at Dustwell. He had unhooked it from her wrists the night before, but hadn't dealt with it. He'd left it coiled on the table because there was too much else to manage, and he'd been tired and she'd been watching him with those measuring eyes, and he hadn't wanted to make a production of it. He took it outside now. She heard him cross the yard, the scrape of iron on rock, then a sound she didn't immediately recognize, the crack of a hammer once, hard, then again, then silence. He came back inside with empty hands and a rag darkened with iron soot. He wiped his hands on the rag and hung it on the nail by the door. The chain did not come back with him. She looked at his empty hands. Something moved across her face. Not dramatic, not a tear, not a flinch. Just the smallest rearrangement of something that had been braced against something else for a very long time. She looked back at her coffee, drank. Breakfast was cornmeal mush and a strip of salt pork fried thin in the iron skillet. He slid a plate across the table to her. She ate like she had the night before, careful, present, not wasting a bite, but not performing hunger either. Just eating the way a person eats when they are relearning that food is allowed. When the edge of it was off, she set the fork down and looked at him directly, full on. No calculation, just her. He didn't look away. "What do they call you?" he asked. Not loudly, not carefully, just a question with room in it. Her jaw tightened, a brief internal argument he wasn't supposed to see. Then, wire, clear, not loud, like a word she was giving him on a specific kind of provisional basis, with the understanding that what he did with it would determine whether he got any more. "Colt," he said back. Touched his chest once. "Brief?" "Colt," she repeated, testing the sound, making it real in the room. A pause, then she asked the question she had been holding since before the fence gap. Since before the ledger and the brass seal and the wagon ride through dust. Why? One word. But it wasn't a simple word. It was every version of why stacked on top of each other. Why step forward? Why the fake document? Why the cold shack? Why the hammer in the yard this morning? Why any of it? Why someone who didn't know her would walk into a situation like that yard and come out with her instead of the nails and canvas he came for. Colt set his fork down, leaned his forearms on the table. "Because they would have cut you down like beef," he said. "And I couldn't stand by for that." He didn't dress it, didn't expand it, didn't reach for something larger or more noble or more comfortable. That was the thing, exactly the thing, the whole of it. She looked at him for a long time. The kind of looking that happens when a person is trying to find the lie and can't locate it, and doesn't know what to do with the absence of a lie because they have built their entire internal architecture on the assumption that the lie is always there. She didn't find one, which confused her, which she did not let show, mostly. "You want payment," she said. Prepared, not ashamed. Just ready for the world, she knew. No, he said it without hesitation, without edge, without the kind of gentleness that is actually condescension wearing a soft shirt. Just, "No, you're not property," he said. "Not meat. You're here because it's better than the road we left behind." He paused. That's all. She held his stare until she believed it, or decided to act as though she did, which, at this point, was close enough to the same thing. He went outside after breakfast to split the morning's wood. She stayed inside for about 4 minutes, then she came out, no shoes, feet bare on the packed dirt of the yard. The torn dress had been tied at the shoulder with a strip from the hem, a rough repair that held the fabric closed over the brand. The silver necklace caught the mid-morning sun. The turquoise beads on her dress winked blue-green in the light. She looked at the chopping block. She looked at the second axe propped against the lean-to wall. She picked it up. He almost said something. Almost. The word was halfway out before he stopped it because she was already testing the weight of the handle, finding the balance, setting her feet in the red dirt, wide and certain, the way she set her feet for everything. And then she split the first round of oak clean down the center with a single stroke. The crack of it rang off the canyon walls. He looked at her. She did not look at him. She set up the next round. So, all right then. They worked. The sound of 2 axes in a rhythm that wasn't quite synchronized, but wasn't fighting each other either. Her strokes were clean, efficient. She read the grain of each round before she hit it, which not everyone did, which was actually the difference between a person who had learned to split wood properly and a person who had only learned to swing hard. She had learned properly. He wondered who taught her. He did not ask. By mid-morning, the stack was waist-high. Her arms gleamed with sweat. Her braids had come half loose, the leather ties slipping with the work, and she'd pushed the left one back over her shoulder without stopping. When they stopped, it wasn't from exhaustion. The pile said stop, so they stopped. He poured water from the barrel, held out the dipper. She took it, drank, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, looked at the stack. He watched her look at it. And here was the thing. She looked at that pile of wood, the way people look at things they have made, with a quiet that wasn't pride exactly, something more fundamental than pride, the look that says, I did this. This is real. This will hold heat in a cold room for actual days of actual winter. This exists because I was here. He had seen that look before. He had not seen it on someone's face in this yard before. He filed it. That evening she taught him a word in her language. She had been doing it since the third morning, one word. Sometimes a noun, sometimes something else. She would say it once, clearly, and look at him, and he would say it back, and she would correct the sound until it was close enough, and then they would move on. He had not once asked what the words meant, which she had noticed. Tonight she said a word that was longer than the others. Complicated. 3 syllables with a sound in the middle that English-speaking mouths weren't built for. He tried it. She corrected him. He tried again. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. Again, she said. He tried again. This time she nodded. What does it mean? He asked. She was safe ground, she said finally. Ground that holds. He looked at her. She looked at the stove. And neither of them said anything else about it. It was the 4th day. The brand had been cleaned twice now. The skin was starting to close at the edges, the raw, shiny surface beginning the long work of becoming scar. He changed the dressing each morning, and she let him, which had taken until the 3rd morning to arrive at. The 1st morning she'd done it herself. The 2nd morning he'd started, and she'd taken over halfway through. The 3rd morning she'd sat and let him do the whole thing without moving, which he understood was a significant event, even though neither of them acknowledged it as such. The 4th morning, he was cleaning the wound when he saw it properly for the first time. He'd been aware of it peripherally since that first night. The scar on her left wrist, below the shackle burn, old, white with age, a clean, deliberate line that ran along the inside of the wrist bone in the specific place that a knotted rope would sit. Not across, along, the cut of someone who was trying to free themselves from something tight, who had cut toward the knot rather than away from the hand. He looked at it. She felt him looking. Her arms. He said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, no edge in it. Who tied you? Not. Who hurt you? Not. What happened? Not the wide-open question that puts a person on a stage. Just the specific thing he had seen and the specific question it raised. She was quiet for a long time. He finished cleaning the brand and applied the bare grease and didn't push. She was going to answer, or she wasn't. Either way, he would still change the dressing tomorrow morning. Either way, the wood was stacked and the food was warm and the door latched from the inside. She spoke. My brother, she said, and then nothing for a breath. And then the rest of it. His name was Roan, older than her by 8 years. Their mother had died in the winter 2 years before. Their father long before that. Roan had become the person who made decisions for the family, and then, over time, the person who made decisions for more than just the family. He had become the person Voss talked to when Voss needed something from the people who lived in the canyon country. Voss needed a lot of things. Favors accumulated, debts accumulated, and eventually the debt got large enough that Roan had run out of ways to make it smaller. Except one way. I said this in pieces. Not a confession, not a story. Pieces dropped into the air between them, like a person emptying a bag they have been carrying too long, and has to do it slowly, or the weight of it will knock them flat. She had tried to run. Once 2 months ago. She had gotten 3 miles into the dark before the rope pulled tight. Roan had tied it himself. She had cut it with the small knife she kept in the fold of her dress. She had made it to the river. They had caught her at the river, and the second time there had been no small knife and no darkness, and the rope had been replaced with iron. And Roan had not looked at her face when they put the shackles on, which was perhaps the most information-dense sentence she had spoken since Dustwell, because a person who looks away when the chain goes on knows what they are doing. Colt sat back. He held the thing she had just given him, carefully, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else and might break, and is not yours to put down carelessly. Then he stood up. He went outside. She heard the axe start, a single note, repeated, hard and measured and going on longer than the wood pile required. She sat with the information that he was angry on her behalf, and did not know what to do with the anger, so he was hitting things, which she had not expected that. She looked at her wrist, the old scar, the new burns from the shackles. The silver cuff she had not taken off in 3 days, because taking it off meant acknowledging how damaged the skin underneath was, and she wasn't ready for that yet. She pulled the cuff off, looked at what was under it, set the cuff on the table, left it there. On the 10th night, she told him about the beads. They were eating. The lamp was low. Outside, the temperature had dropped enough that the fire needed 3 pieces of wood instead of 2, and the wind had found a new gap somewhere near the chimney and was experimenting with it. She reached up and touched one of the turquoise beads on the neckline of her dress. "My mother," she said. He waited. She made this. She traced the line of beads with one finger, down from the shoulder, across the chest, the green-blue stones against the brown leather, each one placed by hands that knew where it should go. She knew each stone. A pause. Said they remember the sky. Colt looked at the beads. He thought about hands that knew where to place things. Hands that had made something beautiful with enough intention that the beauty outlasted them. "She's gone," he said. Not a question. 2 winters, Wire said. He nodded. They ate for a while in the quiet that kind of information makes. Then she said, "Your war." He looked up. "You carry it," she said, not accusing, just naming a thing she had read in the way he held himself at the end of certain days. The way he didn't talk about Missouri directly. "Yes," he said. "People died. Yes, people you couldn't save." He set his fork down, looked at the lamp. Yes, she watched him for a moment. "You saved one," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. Dark eyes. Not performing comfort. Not reaching for something soft to hand him. Just stating what was true. The way she stated everything. Because softening it would have been a kind of lie, and she didn't deal in lies. He didn't know what to do with it, so he just held it. The way she had held what he gave her in the yard 11 days. Then 12, the lean to brace. Held, the roof didn't leak. The mule's shoe was replaced on day 8, when Colt rode to the canyon settlement 6 miles north and came back with 2 new ones, and a bag of cornmeal and some salt pork and a bolt of plain brown cotton that he left on the table without comment. Wire looked at the cotton, looked at him. "For the dress," he said. "If you want." She looked at the torn shoulder seam, the rough strip of leather she'd used to hold it closed. "I can fix it," she said, figured. He said, "Just." He shrugged. In case. She didn't touch the cotton that day. Or the next. On the 3rd day after he brought it, she began cutting it into strips and sewing them into the torn panel of the dress with small, even stitches, using the needle and thread from his repair kit. The repairs were good. Better than good. The kind that didn't announce themselves. The kind that became part of the original. He watched from across the room. He was supposed to be reading the freight invoice he'd been ignoring for 4 days. He was not reading it. He was watching her hands. Broad hands. Strong hands. Hands that split oak and braided hair and mixed bear grease into damaged skin and held coffee cups like they held the warmth on purpose. The scar on the left wrist visible now without the cuff. White against the brown of her skin. Old. Permanent. She looked up and caught him watching. He looked at the invoice. If there was something in her expression that was almost something, he couldn't confirm it because he'd looked away, which, he told himself, was the correct decision. Given everything, he read the invoice. He read it very carefully. It took him a long time. 13 days, the trouble came at night, no warning. Not a lack of warning signs, to be accurate. There had been the smoke smell on the afternoon wind, which Colt had clocked and filed and decided was probably a shepherd's cook fire 2 ridges over. There had been the mule's restlessness at dusk, which he'd attributed to the temperature drop, and there had been the coyotes going quiet, which he had not attributed correctly. He was asleep when the smoke came under the door. Wire was not asleep. She sat up in the dark with the full inventory running before the thought was complete. Smoke, not stove smoke, outside smoke, the lean-to. The lean-to roof was dry wood and old canvas, and would have taken a single torch 10 seconds to catch. She was at the door before the thought finished. She pulled it open. The lean-to was burning, orange and bright and loud in the dark, the flames already eating through the canvas and reaching for the shack's south wall. And in the moving firelight, a shape, a man, coming around the east corner toward the door. He had expected to catch them coming out in confusion, half asleep, unarmed and disoriented. He had not expected the door to open before he reached it. He had not expected her. She was taller than him by a head, and she had the wood-splitting axe that she'd left leaning against the wall inside the door. She didn't raise it, she didn't need to. She stepped into the firelight, and he stopped completely. The way animals stop when they realize they have miscalculated what they were walking toward. His hand went to the knife at his belt. She let him see her make the decision, let him see her look at the knife and look at him, and decide that the knife was not the relevant calculation. She reached out with her left hand, fast, not violent, precise. She caught his wrist before the knife cleared the sheath. Her grip was iron cable strong, the kind built not from a gym or a fight but from a decade of actual labor, and she turned his wrist outward, and the knife dropped into the dirt between them. He tried to pull free. She held, then she used the axe handle. Not the blade, the handle. Across his upper arm in a short, controlled arc. The sound of it was wooden and definitive. He went to his knees. Colt came through the door at a run. He stopped, assessed man on his knees, knife in the dirt. Wire standing over him with the axe handle and a look on her face like the whole thing had been slightly less interesting than splitting oak. Colt looked at the burning lean-to. He looked at Wire. He lowered the rifle. "Is he done?" Colt said. She said. They dealt with the fire. They got the lean-to under control before it reached the shack wall, barely. The canvas roof was gone, and 2 of the support beams were charred to nothing, but the wall held and the structure would survive with new lumber and a week of work. The man from Voss was tied to the water trough post with his own belt. In the morning, Colt took him to the canyon settlement and turned him over to the only man in 50 miles with legitimate badge and instructions to send word to the federal office in Santa Fe about a certain Harlan Voss of the Dustwell trading post. The badge man looked at the man, looked at Colt, looked at the paperwork Colt had filled out on the back of a freight invoice, looked at the brass seal, looked at Colt again. Colt looked back. The badge man took the man. On the ride home, Colt thought about the way Wire had stepped through that door in the firelight. Braids loose, dress unmended, the axe in her hand not like a weapon, but like a tool she had picked up because it was the most appropriate tool for what needed doing, the way she had held the man's wrist, the precise economy of it, the look on her face after, not triumph, not fear release, just done. The task completed. Moving on, he thought about what he'd felt when he'd come through the door and seen her standing there. He wasn't going to examine it too closely. He was just going to note it and set it aside. He filed it next to the sound she'd made that wasn't quite a laugh when he mispronounced the word 3 syllables long. He had a lot of things filed in that particular place now. When he got back, she was already clearing the burned debris from the lean-to. She'd tied her braids back with a strip of cloth. The mended dress was pinned up at the hem so it didn't drag. She didn't look up when he came into the yard. "Need lumber," she said. "I know. And canvas." "I know." She paused. "Set a charred beam aside. Voss sent him alone," she said. Colt set the rifle against the shack wall. Softer probe before the harder one. She was quiet for a moment. So there's a harder one coming," he said. "Yes." She set another beam aside. "You're still here," she said. It wasn't a question, but it was something a question would wear if it didn't want to be too obvious. "I'm still here," he said. She picked up the next beam. He picked up the other end of it. They worked without speaking until the yard was clear. Then she sat on the stoop and looked at the sky. He sat beside her, not close, the width of a person between them. The afternoon light was the red gold of canyon country in autumn. It turned the dust to copper and made the shadows long and blue, and did something complicated to the silver at her collarbone and the turquoise on her dress. "I was going to run again," she said. He waited. That first night, she looked at her hands. The scar on the left wrist catching the low light. I had the gap in the fence measured. I knew how long the chain had to give. She paused. "And then you were there." He said nothing. "I didn't trust you," she said. "I know, I'm still." She stopped. Considered. "I'm still deciding." He nodded. "That's fine," he said. "Deciding is fine." She looked at the canyon. He looked at the canyon. The light went red and then purple, and then the stars came out one by one like something being remembered. "Rome will come," she said. Quiet, like a stone dropped into still water. "My brother, he'll come when Voss sends him." "What will he do when he comes?" Colt said. She was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," she said. And that was the most honest thing he thought that a person could say about family. Because family was the one calculation that never fully resolved. That kept running in the background no matter how many times you closed the window. He didn't say that. He just sat with her in the dark and let it be true. On the 14th night, he was at the table with the freight ledger, logging a month of deliveries that had gone unrecorded because he had not been driving freight for a month. Outside, the wind was down. The temperature had dropped below freezing for the first time. She came from the stove to the table. She stood. He looked up. She was looking at him with the full, steady, dark water gaze that meant a decision had been made. Something that had been calculated from every angle until the calculation came out the same way, no matter how she ran it. "I'm not deciding anymore," she said. He put down the pen. "What does that mean?" he said. She looked at the lamp between them, at the brass C-sill on the shelf, at the freight ledger open to a page with his name written at the top. "It means I know what kind of man you are," she said. "I've watched long enough." He was very still and, he said, she reached across the table. She turned the ledger page to a blank one. She pressed her palm flat on the paper. "I stay," she said. "This is my ground too." He looked at her hand on the page. He looked at her. He reached across and placed his hand beside hers on the paper, not over it. Two hands on a blank page. "Yes," he said. The lamp burned steady. Outside, the canyon held the cold quiet of the first real freeze. Inside, on the shelf above the table, the brass seal sat in the lamplight. An old lie that had told a true thing. A fake document that had produced a real one. And between two people who had run out of reasons not to trust, something that had been building in the spaces between axe strokes and morning coffee, and one word of Apache per day finally settled, not with drama, not with ceremony, just with two hands on a blank page, and the decision, made to stay. 3 days after the 14th night, the frost came back harder, not a light freeze, the kind that cracked the surface of the water barrel in a white spiderweb by morning, the kind that made the mule breathe invisible clouds and turned the canyon walls a deeper red, like the cold had saturated the stone all the way through. Colt was at the lean-to before dawn, checking the new lumber he'd hauled from the canyon settlement. 2 days of work had put the frame back up. The canvas roof stretched tight and tarred at the seams. Not beautiful, but solid enough to hold through the first serious snow if it came. Before he finished the permanent shingles, he worked with his breath misting and his hands cold enough to feel every nail twice. Inside, the stove was going. She had started the fire without him asking again. The 4th morning in a row, he had stopped being surprised by it on the 2nd morning. By the 3rd, he had started leaving the kindling in a specific spot near the grate, so she didn't have to find it in the dark. Small things, the kind that add up to something nobody names until it's already been built. He drove the last nail. He stepped back and looked at the lean-to, and he heard the horses before he saw the dust, not 3 this time, 6. He counted the hoofbeats before they cleared the eastern rise, the rhythm of 6 horses moving at a deliberate pace. Not charging, walking, the pace of men who were not worried about the element of surprise, because they had decided they didn't need it, because they had numbers. Because numbers, in this part of New Mexico territory in the fall of 1882, was generally considered sufficient argument. He walked to the shack. He pushed the door open. Wire was at the stove with the coffee pot. She turned when the door moved. Read his face in the time it took him to cross the threshold. She set the pot down. She didn't ask. He went to the rifle on the wall. He checked the load. Checked it again. Set it against the door frame where his right hand could find it without looking. Then he took the brass seal from the shelf. The freight ledger. He opened the ledger to the page where both their hands had pressed 2 nights ago. His name at the top, the date, and below that, a formal custody notation he had added in the morning after. Deliberately vague, deliberately stamped twice. He looked at Wire. She was already braiding her hair, fast and certain. Both plates pulled tight and tied off with the leather strips, not for aesthetics, because loose hair in a fight was a liability, and she had made that calculation before he had. She reached for the silver necklace on the shelf. Put it on. The layered hammered pieces settling at her collarbone, the turquoise beads on her dress catching the firelight. He understood why. She was not dressing for them. She was dressing as herself, fully, completely. She was going to face whatever was coming as the person she actually was, not the stripped and branded version Voss had put on that crate. She straightened, looked at him. Ready, she said. Not a question. They went outside. Voss rode in the lead. Different this time. No practiced smile, no easy Voss. He wore a coat Colt hadn't seen before. The kind of coat a man puts on when he wants to look like a person with authority. Behind him, Cord with the rifle. The young jumpy one from the first visit. 2 new men, broad and flat-faced, and the specific kind of quiet that means they are being paid to be present and not to think. And on the far right, a man in a weathered tan jacket with a badge on his chest, not a federal badge, a territorial one. The kind issued by county administrators to men who needed legitimacy in places where legitimacy was otherwise unavailable. Colt looked at the badge. The badge man didn't look comfortable. He kept his hands visible and his eyes moving. The look of someone who had been told this, was straightforward and was revising that estimate on the evidence currently in front of him. Voss pulled up 20 yards out. He looked at Wire, and for the first time, just for a second, something moved across his face that wasn't confidence. She was standing beside Colt, not behind him, and she was taller than Colt by enough that Voss had to adjust his eyeline upward. The silver caught the morning sun, the turquoise beads, the braids, the X brand visible at her left shoulder where the dress showed it fully. She wasn't hiding it. She was wearing it like information, like evidence. Voss recovered, Yarrow, he said. We're done negotiating. I've got a territorial deputy. I've got a legal sale contract signed and witnessed. He reached into his coat, drew out a folded paper. This is done the proper way. He looked at the badge man. The badge man nodded without enthusiasm. Colt said nothing. He looked at the paper in Voss's hand. Then he looked at Wire, And he did the thing he had decided to do at 2 in the morning when he couldn't sleep, and the wind was working the chimney gap, and he'd been lying there going through the possibilities. He reached into his coat. He took out the brass seal and the ledger, and he held them out to her, not to use himself, to her. She looked at what he was holding, then at him, then at the 6 riders, then back at him. "You know what it says," he said, quietly. "You've read it," she had. He'd watched her read it twice, slowly and carefully in the lamplight on the 9th evening, with the focused stillness of someone who is teaching themselves something important. "Read it to them," he said. Silence. She took the ledger, she took the seal. She stood with both in her hands and looked at Voss, and then she began to read, not fast, not performed. The way she did everything. Deliberate, certain. Her voice was low and even and carried across 20 yards of canyon dirt like it had no trouble going the distance. She read the custody notation, the date. The jurisdiction citation Colt had copied from an old federal invoice he'd put at the bottom of the satchel for 4 years. The name of the logistics office. The description of the transport irregularity. The notation that the subject of the order was under federal protective custody pending review, and that any interference with said custody constituted a federal offense under 3 specific clauses he had listed in small, careful handwriting. She read every word, including his name, including hers. When she finished, she looked up at Voss and pressed the seal into the page. The sound it was small, deliberate, a period. Not a question. Voss stared at her, not at Colt. At her, the badge man was staring at her too, with an expression that had moved fully from discomfort into something that looked very much like he was reconsidering his employer's characterization of the situation. The young jumpy one had his hand nowhere near his holster. Cord was very still. Voss opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That don't mean anything," he said. But the smooth was gone. Just a voice now, a man's voice. "Not impressed with itself, it means enough," Colt said. "And you know it." Voss looked at the paper in her hands, at the seal, at the ledger with both their names in it, at the badge man who was studying the distance with sudden interest. He looked at the rifles, he looked at Wire. She held the ledger and the seal, and did not move and did not blink. Voss said, "We ride in, we take her. That's the end of it." He raised his hand, and they moved. It happened fast. And not the way things happen when you have planned for them, and the other side hasn't fully committed to the plan they're executing. Cord brought the rifle up, and Colt was already moving left, off the stoop, angling toward the cover of the water trough. The 2 flat-faced men came off their horses, and Wire stepped back through the door and came back out with the wood axe, and the look of a person who has already done this once a month, and found it manageable. The young one froze. Clean meat, freeze, hand on holster. Feet not moving, the specific paralysis of a person who thought they were going to be in a situation and discovered the situation was not what they'd pictured. Colt had the rifle up, Cord swung his barrel. The badgeman did something unexpected. He backed his horse up, 2 steps, clear of the line, hands raised to his own chest, open, visible. "I ain't dying for a trading post dispute," he said. To no one specifically. To the situation, Cord looked at him. The 2 flat-faced men looked at him. Voss looked at him with an expression of pure betrayal. And in that exact moment of collective looking, Wire moved. She went for Cord, not with the axe. She used the axe handle to knock his rifle arm up and sideways as he was turning back from looking at the badgeman, and the shot went into the sky, and the horse screamed and shied, and Cord went off the left side of the saddle and hit the ground hard enough to lose the rifle on impact. She had his rifle before he found his footing. She stood with it and looked at Voss, just Voss. He was the only one left on a horse. The 2 flat-faced men had stopped moving. Cord was on his knees in the dirt. The young one had both hands in the air without being asked. Voss on his horse, holding the signed contract in his hand, the paper that had Roan's name on it. The paper that said she was property that could be sold. The paper he had brought, he believed paper was the thing that made reality, that gave his decisions the weight of law in places where law was what you could enforce. He looked at the paper. He looked at her. She was holding Cord's rifle. She knew how to hold a rifle. It was obvious in the way she held it, the way her arms and shoulders had the memory of it. Colt stood 15 feet to Voss's right, his own rifle level. Wire stood at the center. "Get down," she said, not loud. Voss got down. They tied Voss and Cord to the water trough posts with the same rope that had been in the lean-to since Colt moved in. The flat-faced men left at a pace slightly faster than dignity allowed and didn't look back. The young one left first, before anyone suggested it, at a speed that implied he had somewhere else to be, that he had just remembered the badge man sat on his horse at the edge of the yard. He looked at Voss, at the rope, at the trough. He looked at Colt. "Santa Fe's going to want a full account," he said. "I'll send one," Colt said. The badge man looked at Wire. She looked back at him. He touched the brim of his hat, once, brief, the gesture of a man acknowledging something he's going to think about for a long time. Then he rode. The yard was quiet. The horses that had lost their riders grazed near the east edge of the property with the offended air of animals who had not signed up for this. The mule watched them from the trough with deep suspicion. Voss was saying nothing. He had been saying nothing since she had told him to get down. He sat with the rope around his wrists and looked at the dirt and seemed to be engaged in a private reckoning that no one else was invited to. Colt stood near the shack door. Wire was 3 feet from Voss, just looking at him. Colt watched her do it. He watched her take in the man who had put her on a crate, who had described her in specific terms, who had called a butcher, who had looked at her with measuring eyes that counted yield and dismissed everything else. She looked at him for a long time. And then she said, "You thought you could sell what I was." Voss didn't look up. "You were wrong," she said. "About what I was." She stepped back. She turned away from him. Completely. The way you put down a tool you no longer need. Not with drama. Not with satisfaction. Just finished with it. Moving on. She walked to where Colt stood. They looked at each other. "It's done," he said. "Not yet," she said. He raised an eyebrow. She looked down the eastern road. He followed her eyeline and saw the figure at the edge of the canyon cut. A man alone, standing at the property line, not moving. Colt recognized him from her description. Older than her by 8 years, broader through the chest. The same dark eyes, but with something in them that hers didn't have. Something that had been living with a specific weight for a long time and had compressed under it. He stood at the edge of the yard. He did not move closer. He had no weapon visible. His hands were at his sides, open. He was wearing a coat too thin for the temperature and boots that had walked a long way to get here. He had not come on a horse. He had come on foot, which, in this territory, in this weather, meant he had walked since before dawn. Wire stood still. Colt stayed where he was because this was not his, this was hers. Whatever happened in the next few minutes was entirely hers to navigate, and he would not step into the middle of it unless she needed him to. Roan looked at his sister. She looked back. The distance between them was 20 feet, and also something else entirely. Something measured not in yards, but in the weight of what had been done, and what could not be undone, and what was left to be decided in the space between. He didn't speak first. Neither did she. The wind moved through the yard, picked up the edge of her dress fringe. "Let it go," then Roan said. "I came to warn you." His voice was rough, not from cold, from the roughness of someone who has been composing a sentence in their head for days, and is discovering that saying it out loud makes it smaller than it felt. "You're late," she said, flat. True. He looked at the men tied to the trough, at Cord, at Voss, at the rope. "I see that anyway," he said. She looked at him for a long time. "Why?" she said. "Not. Why did you come?" Everything she meant was in the word. "Why did you sign the paper? Why did you tie the rope? Why did you look away when the chain went on? Why did you let it come to a crate at Dustwell? Why any of it? The whole accounting delivered in one syllable. Roan looked at the ground. He was quiet for so long that the wind had time to move twice through the yard. Then he said, "Because the debt was real, and I didn't have another answer." "I was the answer," she said. "Yes, you knew, yes." He didn't reach for justification. He didn't explain the size of the debt, or the pressure he had been under, or the way Voss had laid out the terms with the specific practiced inevitability of a man who had done this before, and knew which words to use. He didn't say any of that, because she knew all of it already. And none of it was the question she was asking. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words. The most inadequate 2 words in the English language, and also sometimes the only ones left. She looked at him. He looked at her. And she said nothing for so long that Colt, standing by the door, felt the weight of it in his own chest. Then she said, "I know, not, I forgive you. It's all right. Not, come inside," which meant, "I hear you. I am not yet ready to do anything with you. But I am not walking away from this doorway with nothing settled between us." Roan nodded, one slow nod. The nod of a man accepting a sentence that is fair. Then he reached into his coat. He drew out something small. He took 3 steps toward her and stopped, set it on the ground between them. A small bundle wrapped in brown leather, tied with thin sinew cord. He stepped back. He did not explain it, because he didn't need to. She knew what it was. She stood and looked at it on the ground. Colt couldn't see her face from where he stood, but he could see her shoulders, and the particular way they moved. Not a flinch, not a sob. Something quieter and deeper than either. The way a person's body responds to being handed back something they had grieved as lost. She bent and picked up the bundle. She held it in both hands. She looked at her brother. "You know where I live now," she said. Roan looked at the shack, at the rebuilt lean-to, at the wood pile and the water trough and the mule and the freight wagon, at the space that was clearly no longer just a stopping point on a supply road. He looked at Colt for the first time. Colt looked back. Something passed between them, not warm, not hostile. The assessment of 2 people, with no reason to trust each other, and one very significant reason to figure out how to be in the same territory without it becoming a problem. Roan looked back at Wire. "I'll go," he said. He turned. He walked back toward the canyon cut, the same direction he'd come from, coat too thin. Boots that had walked a long way. She watched him until he was gone. She stood there a moment longer after he disappeared. Then she turned and walked to the stoop and sat down and opened the leather bundle in her lap. Inside was a string of turquoise beads, not the small ones on her dress. Larger, deep sky blue, the color that didn't exist in this desert except in stone. Each bead was shaped by hand, slightly imperfect, slightly different from the ones on either side. Strung on sinew cord, knotted between each bead, so that if the string broke, you wouldn't lose them all. Her mother's, the ones she had thought were gone with everything else. She held the string in both hands. The beads were cool from the cold and then warm from her palms. She didn't put them on. She just held them. Colt sat beside her on the stoop. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She looked at the beads for a long time. Then she looked at the canyon, the frost on the red walls beginning to catch the mid-morning light and turning it into something almost gentle. She would have liked this place, she said. "Your mother?" "Yes." He looked at the canyon. "It's a good view," he said. She liked good views. They sat in the cold and the quiet for a while. Then she said, "He brought them back." "Yes. That doesn't fix it." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She turned the beads in her hands, the turquoise catching light. "But it's something," she said. "Yes," he said. "It's something." She stood up. She went inside. He followed. They drove Voss and Cord to the canyon settlement that afternoon. The badge man was already there. He took them with the expression of a man who has revised his fee upward in his head and is wondering how to have that conversation. Colt gave him the full written account he'd promised, 3 pages in the freight ledger in his small, careful handwriting, sealed twice, dated and signed. He also included a formal complaint about the conditions at the Dustwell trading post and the specific nature of the auction he had witnessed on October 14th. He was not certain it would result in anything. He filed it anyway. On the ride back, the sun was already low, the canyon walls turned their deep evening red, the mule moved at its steady, reliable pace, and the cold had the smell of coming snow in it, the dry mineral smell that the territory gets in late autumn before the first real storms. Wire sat beside him on the wagon seat. She had ridden out on horseback, one of the horses left behind in the yard that morning. She had switched to the wagon seat at the settlement without explanation. He hadn't asked. They drove in quiet for a while, then she said, "He won't come back, Voss, yes." Colt thought about it. "No," he said, "he won't." Because of the federal report, partly he watched the road, partly because some men know when a thing has cost more than it was ever going to be worth. She was quiet, and Roan, she said. He didn't answer that one for a moment. "That's a longer thing," he said. "That one doesn't resolve in a morning." "No," she said. "Do you want it to?" he said. Eventually, she looked at the canyon walls. "He's my only family," she said, which was its own answer. He nodded. They drove. The snow came 3 days later, light at first, the kind that came sideways in the wind and didn't accumulate, but let you know it was serious about returning. By evening it was falling straight down and sticking to the lean-to roof and the window ledge and the mule's back. Colt stoked the stove until the iron was almost too hot to stand near. Wire had strung the turquoise beads on a new cord and hung them from the shelf nail, not wearing them yet, just there where she could see them. She had placed the silver cuff back on her left wrist on the morning after Roan left, not because she'd decided the scar underneath didn't matter, but because she'd decided the scar was not the most important thing about her wrist. Small distinctions, the kind that change everything. She was at the table with the bolt of brown cotton, cutting a new panel for the dress. The repairs she'd made earlier had held, but the original tear at the shoulder had left the fabric compromised, and she'd decided to replace the whole panel rather than patch it again. She worked with the focused quiet that she brought to all physical tasks: scissors, needle, thread. Colt was at the other end of the table, pretending to read the freight invoice he'd been pretending to read for 3 weeks. The lamp between them was the warm yellow of good oil. The stove ticked. Outside, the snow fell without drama. Inside, the temperature was the comfortable warmth that makes a person aware of how good it is to be inside. He was watching her hands, not watching, just aware of. There was a distinction, and he was maintaining it with moderate success. She said, without looking up, "You're staring." "I'm reading. You've been reading that same page since October." He looked at the invoice. She was right. Same page. October 14th, the date of the Dustwell delivery. He had not turned it. He turned it. She made the sound, the one that was almost a laugh, the one that had been appearing with increasing regularity over the past 2 weeks, and had gone from almost a laugh to nearly a laugh to something that on 3 specific occasions had been an actual laugh, short and real and gone quickly, like something that surprised her by existing. He liked the sound. He was not going to say that he read the next page of the invoice. It was a delivery manifest from August, entirely unrelated to anything. He read it very carefully. That night, the snow still falling, the stove low and steady, she came to his side of the room, not hesitant, not performing certainty either, just herself, walking across a room in a way that communicated she had decided something, and had decided it clearly, and was now acting on it. She sat on the floor near his bedroll. He sat up. They looked at each other in the low firelight, the silver at her collarbone, the turquoise beads on the shelf behind her catching the red glow from the stove grate, her braids loose for the night, falling over both shoulders. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right, and I want you to answer true." "Yes," he said. She looked at him. Long, the full reading, the complete inventory that she had been running since Dustwell, since the yard, since the water barrel and the first cup of coffee, and the morning he'd hammered the chain to pieces in the dirt. "Is this?" She paused, not from uncertainty, from precision, finding the right word. "Is this real to you?" He didn't answer immediately, not because he was uncertain, because the question deserved the full weight of a real answer, and not the fast reflexive one that would have been easy. He thought about Dustwell, the yard, the brass seal that was a lie that became a truth. He thought about the ledger with both their hands on the blank page, about the word she'd taught him that meant safe ground, about the chain broken in the dirt on the first morning, about the lean-to rebuilt board by board, about the beads on the shelf and what it had cost her to carry the knowing of them for 2 years, and what it cost to hold them now. He thought about the sound that was almost a laugh, and then was, "Yes," he said, "Sibyl. Direct, no architecture around it." She looked at him for another moment, then she said, "Good," and she lay down beside him, not uncertain, not asking. She had asked. He had answered. The rest of it was just the natural direction of two people who had been circling a decision for long enough that making it felt less like arriving somewhere and more like acknowledging where they'd already been. He lay beside her, the fire held low, the snow kept falling. The ceremony was her idea, not on that night. A week later, when the snow had come and gone and left the canyon country white-edged and crystalline, and the kind of clean that only exists after the first real freeze, she brought it up in the morning, matter of fact, over coffee. The way she brought up everything that mattered. Direct, clear, no preamble. "I want to do it right," she said. He looked up from the coffee. "Right how?" he said. "Our way," she said. "Not a courthouse, not a preacher." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "Here, with what we have." He thought about it. She nodded. "Tonight," she said. He spent the day doing the things that he did doing, the mule, the wood, the freight manifest he actually read and actually logged, all the way through every page. Because he was a man who finished things. She spent the day at the stove, and then at the table, and then outside in the cold air, standing near the water trough, looking at the canyon with her arms crossed and her face turned toward the wind, the way she did when she was settling something internally. At dusk, she came inside and changed into the dress, not the working version with the repair panels, the original, the full dress, brown deerskin with the fringe at the hem and hips, the turquoise beads along the neckline, the silver cuff on her left wrist. She braided her hair with care, both plaits tight and perfect, tied with the leather strips. She took the turquoise bead string from the shelf, her mother's beads. She held them for a moment, then she set them on the table. He was at the stove in his cleanest shirt, which was a relative designation, but he had done what he could, and he had shaved, which was more than he usually managed on a weekday in November. She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamp was between them, the fire in the stove steady. Outside, the canyon held its cold quiet, and the stars were the kind of brilliant that only happens when the air is dry and the temperature is below freezing, and there's no moon to compete. She picked up the bead string. She looked at him. A question without words. He understood. He held out his hand. She wrapped the bead string around their joined hands, her fingers working carefully, the sinew cord looping twice, the turquoise beads warm now from her palms, cool stone that had held her mother's hands and now held theirs. She spoke first, in her language, 3 sentences, low and even, and carrying the particular weight of words that have existed long before the people speaking them, and will exist long after. He didn't know all the words. He knew the one she'd taught him on the 3rd morning. Safe ground, ground that holds, he heard it in there. Then she looked at him, his turn. He was not a man who made speeches. He was a man who drove freight across canyon roads and mended lean-tos and made decisions at specific moments about what kind of person he was willing to be. He did not have prepared words, so he said true ones. "I will stay," he said. "I will stand beside you, not in front. Not behind," he paused. "I will tell you the truth even when it's uncomfortable, and I'll expect the same back." Another pause, "And I will not look away. Whatever comes." He looked at their joined hands. "There's a sinew cord. I've already proven I know how to look away, and I already proven I know I can't live with it. So, I won't." She looked at him. The lamp was steady. The fire was steady. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, the way a person presses their forehead against something solid when they need to feel that it's real, that it's there, that it holds. He stayed still, let her feel it, real, there, holding. Then she kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the bead string stayed wrapped around their hands until they both remembered it was there some time later, and unwrapped it carefully, and she hung it back on the shelf nail where it lived, next to her, in her home. Winter moved through the canyon country slowly and without apology. November became December. The snow came and went and came back harder. The stove burned through the wood pile, and they restacked it twice. The mule grew its winter coat and developed strong opinions about the cold, and communicated them vocally at dawn every morning, which Colt found less endearing than he might have, and Wire found funnier than he thought was strictly necessary. She laughed more in December, not the almost law, the real one, short and quick and gone, like it still surprised her by arriving, but arriving more reliably now, arriving over small things, the mule's complaints, a loaf of cornbread that came out of the pan in 2 pieces instead of 1, the freight invoice he'd been carrying since October, that he finally filed in the satchel in early December with an air of great personal accomplishment. He did not tell her he found the sound of it the best thing in the canyon. She probably knew. She was very good at reading things. Yajadri, she told him, morning, early, before the light was full. She had been awake before him, which was unusual. She was sitting near the stove with her coffee, and her braids loose and the silver cuff on, and the bead string wound once around her wrist over the cuff, which she had started doing in December. He sat up. She looked at him. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach. He went still. He looked at her hand, then at her face, the full dark water gaze, steady, certain, with something in it that was new. Something that was its own kind of measuring, but different from the kind she'd been doing since Dustwell. This was the kind of measuring that looks forward instead of around. Life, she said, one word with everything in it. He got up. He crossed the room without thinking about it. He sat beside her and put his hand over hers on her stomach, warm, real, both their hands there. He didn't speak for a long moment. He was holding it, letting it settle, feeling its actual weight. It was considerable. It was the best considerable he had ever felt. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He thought about it, honestly. The way she always asked him to think about things. He paused. "I need a minute. Take it," she said. He took it. He sat with his hand over hers and looked at the stove and did the quiet interior work of a man becoming a different version of himself. Not better or worse, just expanded. The way a room becomes a different room when you understand it, goes somewhere you didn't know about. Then he said, "We need to write to the canyon settlement, Doctor." "Yes," she said, "and we need more lumber before the second freeze." "Yes, and I should look at the roof on the east side. There's a board that's going to give when the snow loads." "Colt," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at him with the expression that had replaced the measuring one, the one he didn't have a word for yet, the one that appeared when she thought he was being himself, in a way that she found. She had never said what she found it, but the expression said something. "We have time," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "we do." He put his arm around her. She leaned into him, not collapsing, not giving weight, just leaning. The deliberate lean of a person who has decided that leaning is something they can do here, that the ground is solid, that it holds safe ground. The word she'd given him on the third morning. He understood it differently now. Spring came the way it always did in Canyon country, not gently. The melt came hard and fast, and the wash ran with actual water for the first time since Colt had used the shack as a stop. The red walls of the canyon went dark with moisture and then dried to a brighter version of their usual color, the way wet stone looks when it remembers what it actually is. The wild grasses came up along the east side of the property, the first of them tentative and pale, and then more certain, and then the vivid green of spring in desert country that almost looks impossible. The mule was pleased about the grass. It communicated this with slightly less volume than it communicated displeasure, which Colt chose to interpret as gratitude. He was adding a second room, not fast, between freight runs that had resumed in March, hauling nails and flour and mail across the canyon trails the way he'd always done. But when he was home, he was cutting lumber and laying foundation and thinking about windows and where the light would come in at different hours. She had opinions about the windows. Strong opinions, he had been warned. She wanted the east window larger than he'd planned. For the morning light, she demonstrated her position by standing in the approximate location of the proposed window at sunrise and describing, with the calm specificity of someone who has thought about this considerably, exactly what the light would do if the opening was 12 inches wider. He made it 12 inches wider. She said nothing about this. But she put her hand on the window frame when it was done and stood there for a moment with the morning light coming through it and the expression that he still didn't have a word for. He decided the window looked right. On an afternoon in April, he came home from a freight run to find Roan at the property line, Agon, on foot again. This time, Wire was already outside, standing 10 feet from the line, not from the door, 10 feet closer than last time. They were talking, not warmly, not easily, but talking. He could see it from the road. Her arms crossed, his hands at his sides, both of them with the posture of two people navigating a conversation that doesn't have good footing yet but is being attempted anyway. Colt stopped the wagon at the lean-to. He unhitched the mule. He went inside. He put water on for coffee and laid the freight invoice on the table and started logging the months he'd let accumulate. October, November, December, January, February, March. He was on February when she came in. He didn't look up. She poured herself coffee. Sat across from him. He's going to come back, she said. Again. In a few weeks, Colt wrote a number in the column. All right, he said. I told him not to stay long. That's fine, she stopped. He's trying. Colt looked up. She was looking at the bead string on her wrist, her finger moving along the turquoise beads, the ones that had been her mother's, that had been carried back across distance by hands that had done wrong and were trying to find a way to do different. I know, Colt said. She looked at him. It's going to be slow, she said. The best things are, he said. She considered that, drank her coffee. Outside, the spring light moved across the canyon in that slow afternoon way, the shadows growing long and blue. The wild grass was bright on the east side. The new window frame sat in the second room, waiting for glass he'd ordered from the settlement, and hadn't arrived yet, the light coming through the opening clean and direct, and doing exactly what she'd said it would do. She put her hand on the table. He put his beside it, not covering it, beside it, the way it had been on the blank page that first night, the way it would be, he understood now, for a very long time. Side by side, enough space between to be two people, close enough that the warmth carried. He looked at the window, the light, the green grass coming up along the east wall. He thought about Dustwell, the yard, the crowd, the brass seal that was a lie. The woman who stood between two iron posts in a torn dress with turquoise beads and silver at her collarbone, and her feet set deep in the red dirt and her eyes measuring the distance to the fence. He thought about what he'd almost done, the stove, the coffee, the quiet, the road, without her. He was glad he hadn't taken it. He turned back to the freight invoice. He finished the column. He turned the page. Outside, the canyon held them. The shack held them. The new room waiting to be finished held them. And the child coming in summer, the one who did not know yet that they were arriving into a world built for them, board by board and bead by bead, and one true word at a time, that held them too. The canyon country opened wide and bright past the new east window, past what the eye could see, past what the mind could plan for, past the places they'd been into the ones they hadn't reached yet, ground that holds, still holding,